Every single day of your existence, you've been evaluated against a standard that doesn't actually exist in the real world. Society convinced you that cognitive capacity was something quantifiable through standardized testing, academic achievements, or credentials mounted in expensive frames. They programmed you to believe that mental prowess was demonstrated by your capacity to recall information on demand or your speed in solving abstract mathematical equations. This narrative was fabricated because it served a purpose for those in control. Authentic cognitive mastery bears no relationship to institutional education systems. It transcends the polite definitions that comfortable society clings to for validation. Real intelligence is fundamentally about strategic positioning and dominance. It represents your ability to survive and thrive in hostile environments. It's the capacity to bend circumstances to your vision before circumstances crush you beneath their weight. History's greatest strategic minds understood this fundamental truth, while the masses wasted energy trying to appear intellectually impressive. There exists an invisible hierarchy, a concealed structure of mental evolution that determines who consumes and who gets consumed, who commands and who submits. The vast majority of humanity, perhaps 9 out of every 10 people walking this planet, never escape the first tier of this hierarchy. They exist in perpetual cognitive haze, believing they exercise free will when they're merely executing programming installed by external forces. But there are those rare individuals who climb. 7 distinct tiers of cognitive evolution exist, 7 stages of psychological awakening. What I'm about to reveal will strip away every comfortable illusion you've built around your self-perception. This will function as a psychological mirror held up to your innermost consciousness. The reflection won't be pleasant, and it might genuinely hurt, because you're about to discover exactly where you stand in this hidden hierarchy. Once you perceive this structure, there's no returning to ignorance. The people surrounding you will appear transformed. You'll notice the invisible threads controlling their movements, the emptiness behind their confident expressions. So the real question becomes whether you possess sufficient courage to confront your actual ranking in this cognitive hierarchy. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people who watch aren't subscribed yet. Take a moment to genuinely observe your surroundings with fresh perspective. Position yourself in any densely populated urban environment during peak commuting hours. Study the expressions worn by strangers packed into public transportation. Wait in any commercial queue and really examine what you're witnessing. What becomes immediately apparent? You're surrounded by those locked in perpetual sleep, those trapped at the foundation level of this hierarchy. This represents the most densely populated tier of cognitive existence. The individual at this foundational stage isn't necessarily lacking in raw intellectual capacity or processing speed. They might possess impressive academic credentials, practice medicine or law, manage complex financial accounts, or demonstrate technical proficiency in various fields. Some can recite classical literature from memory or write sophisticated computer algorithms. Yet despite these surface-level capabilities, they remain functionally unconscious. Cognitive function at this foundational tier operates purely through stimulus-response mechanisms without deeper processing. This person doesn't initiate action based on internal compass or authentic desire. Instead, external stimuli determine every movement and decision they make throughout their existence. Their entire life unfolds as an endless sequence of conditioned biological responses and socially programmed behaviors playing out automatically. When the alarm device activates, they rise without questioning why. When authority figures issue commands, compliance follows reflexively. When media personalities make assertions, acceptance occurs without scrutiny. When commercial messaging appears, purchasing behavior triggers predictably. They maintain the illusion that their beliefs and opinions originate from autonomous thinking processes. However, when you apply even gentle pressure, when you ask them to explain the origin and reasoning behind their stated convictions, the facade completely disintegrates. They'll regurgitate headlines absorbed from social media platforms, or echo sentiments implanted during childhood by parental figures. They function as empty containers filled with other people's intellectual property, never generating original thought. The great strategist Machiavelli identified this category precisely when describing those so simple-minded and dominated by immediate circumstances that anyone seeking to deceive them will invariably find willing subjects. The defining characteristic of this sleeping population is their complete absence of personal agency and self-determination. They exist with what psychologists term an external locus of control, meaning they attribute all life outcomes to forces beyond their influence. Economic conditions, governmental policies, romantic partners, random chance. Anything except their own choices gets blamed when circumstances disappoint. They've adopted a permanent victim identity, floating passively down life's river while refusing to grab the oars and navigate with intention. From a psychological perspective, the sleeper experiences profound terror when confronted with genuine autonomy and freedom. Liberty doesn't register as a gift or opportunity, but rather as an overwhelming burden they desperately want to escape. Present them with unlimited freedom and complete self-determination, and you'll witness panic rather than joy. But here's what makes this level so psychologically stable for those trapped within it. They've developed an intense craving for external structure and authority to eliminate the anxiety of choice. They need to be instructed about what qualifies as moral versus immoral, what they should pursue, and what their next action should be at every moment. This explains the sleeper's obsessive relationship with consensus and majority opinion. They cannot feel psychologically safe holding any belief until they've confirmed it aligns with what most others think. Before forming any stance, they compulsively check collective reactions and popular sentiment. They monitor trending opinions before buying products, adopting fashion, or expressing political views. Their deepest psychological fear isn't being factually incorrect. It's finding themselves isolated from the herd. Standing alone in their convictions represents their ultimate nightmare scenario. You recognize these individuals immediately once you know what to observe. They populate your workplace, sit across from you at family gatherings, and constitute the vast majority of faces you pass daily. They represent background characters in humanity's unfolding historical narrative, filling space and generating ambient noise without leaving any lasting impact on the world's trajectory. They function as biological batteries powering systems and structures designed by those operating at higher cognitive tiers. They consume products, generate economic activity through labor, and then get replaced by the next generation of sleepers in an endless cycle. If you exist at this foundational level, statistical probability suggests you wouldn't have encountered this particular video because algorithmic systems don't expose this category of challenging content to sleeping audiences. However, if you were previously asleep and experiencing your first moments of awakening consciousness right now, you need to understand something crucial about that uncomfortable sensation you're feeling. What appears as a cliffhanger, that persistent discomfort, that nagging internal sense that your life doesn't truly belong to you, isn't a clinical symptom of depressive disorder requiring pharmaceutical intervention. It's actually reality beginning to penetrate through the comfortable anesthesia that's kept you numb and compliant. When someone transitions out of sleep state, they don't immediately acquire wisdom or strategic thinking capacity. Instead, they become noticeably vocal and reactive as they enter the second tier of cognitive development. The individual at the second tier has achieved a significant realization that separates them from the sleeping masses. They've recognized that social existence operates according to game-like rules and mechanics. They understand that cognitive ability functions as a form of currency that purchases respect, elevated social positioning, and external validation from others. However, they haven't yet developed authentic, original thinking capacity, so they engage in intellectual theft, borrowing the thoughts and frameworks of others and presenting them as their own understanding. This second-tier individual represents what we call the intellectual middle tier, the person who has just enough knowledge to be dangerous to themselves and annoying to others. Picture the individual at social gatherings who strategically deploys sophisticated vocabulary they don't genuinely comprehend, hoping the linguistic complexity will mask their shallow understanding. They're the social media activists who adopt whatever cause currently trends in their ideological circles, motivated not by authentic compassion or conviction, but by the signaling value it provides to their desired peer group. They consume summaries and reviews of important books while never engaging with the actual texts themselves. They quote philosophical giants whose work they've never seriously studied, whose depths they've never genuinely explored. At this second level of development, intelligence transforms into theatrical performance rather than practical tool. It becomes costume jewelry worn to impress others rather than genuine wealth. The mimic develops an obsessive fixation with the superficial appearance and aesthetic presentation of intellectual life. They accumulate academic degrees, professional certifications, and impressive-sounding job titles like a collector hoarding shiny objects, each addition to the collection serving primarily to signal status. They need everyone in proximity to acknowledge and affirm their intelligence. They crave the applause and recognition like an addict craves their substance. This tier represents maximum danger for your ego structure because reaching level 2 creates a powerful illusion of superiority. You look down at the sleeping masses from your elevated position and think you've transcended their limitations. You observe their unconscious reactions and feel smugly superior, telling yourself you've awakened while they remain trapped. But you haven't genuinely awakened to reality. You've simply traded one comfortable dream for another slightly more sophisticated dream. The second-tier individual remains imprisoned by the Dunning-Kruger effect, that cognitive bias where limited knowledge creates inflated confidence. They know just enough information to believe they've achieved expertise, but they lack sufficient knowledge to recognize the vast territories of their ignorance. Machiavelli warned specifically about this psychological type in his writings. He described those who confuse the superficial appearance of virtuous qualities with the actual possession of virtue itself. The mimic operates under the delusion that resembling a leader makes them a leader, that sounding like a philosopher makes them a philosopher, that the performance equals the reality. However, apply genuine pressure to test their capabilities. Present them with novel problems requiring original solutions. Ask them to construct new systems from foundational principles rather than copying existing templates. Watch them mentally collapse because their abilities end at replication. They cannot generate, innovate, or create anything genuinely original. They function as echoes bouncing off canyon walls, as reflections in mirrors showing images created by others. The profound tragedy defining the mimic's existence is their addiction to validation from external sources. Their entire sense of self-worth dangles precariously from the approval of the intellectual class they desperately aspire to join, but never truly will. They live in constant terror of exposure as frauds, which generates rigid, defensive psychological patterns. This fear manifests as aggressive reactions when their knowledge or credentials get questioned. If you recognize yourself constantly trying to prove your correctness in conversations, if you find yourself memorizing arguments and talking points to win debates rather than genuinely seeking truth and understanding, you remain stuck at Tier 2. You've become a parrot, colorful and capable of mimicking human speech patterns, but fundamentally incapable of generating authentic thought. But what happens when someone finally releases their desperate need for external approval? That's when genuine darkness begins to emerge, when you stop performing intellectual theater for others and start observing reality without comfortable filters. That transition marks ascension to the third tier, where everything changes. If you're finding value in this psychological breakdown, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these insights into human cognition. The third tier represents where authentic personal agency first emerges in recognizable form. This is the tactical fox operating with strategic precision. The individual who reaches this cognitive level has completely abandoned the need for social validation and recognition. They no longer invest energy worrying whether others perceive them as intelligent or impressive. Their focus has shifted entirely to tangible outcomes and winning whatever games they choose to play. This marks the genuine beginning of self-determined action rather than reaction to external programming. The tactician observes the world around them, all the legal frameworks, moral guidelines, social contracts, and cultural expectations, and experiences a profound realization that changes everything. These aren't absolute universal truths handed down from some cosmic authority. They're arbitrary human constructions, rule systems that can be analyzed, understood, and strategically bent when necessary to achieve desired outcomes. Machiavelli articulated this principle with characteristic precision when he wrote that the lion cannot protect himself from traps, while the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. Therefore, one must become a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. The third-tier tactician embodies the fox archetype perfectly. They possess the pattern recognition to identify traps before stepping into them. They understand incentive structures that drive human behavior at deep levels. When they observe their employer, romantic partner, or governmental institutions, they're constantly analyzing underlying motivations. What does this person or entity truly want beneath their stated goals? What fears drive their decisions? How can I leverage this understanding to achieve my objectives? Intelligence at Tier 3 becomes fundamentally transactional in nature. It operates with cold calculation rather than warm human connection. It prioritizes strategic positioning over authentic relationship. The tactician demonstrates remarkable effectiveness at navigating complex social and professional environments. They ascend corporate hierarchies not through superior work ethic or longer hours, but through superior maneuvering and political intelligence. They've mastered the knowledge of precisely who deserves flattery and who can be safely ignored. They understand the critical timing of when speaking serves their interests versus when strategic silence works better. However, this tier comes with a significant psychological cost that many don't anticipate. The tactician often experiences profound loneliness and isolation. When you process every human interaction through a transactional lens, calculating the exchange value of each conversation and relationship, you systematically destroy the organic human elements that create genuine connection. You begin perceiving people around you as chess pieces to be positioned rather than complex human beings worthy of authentic engagement. While this perspective generates personal power and effectiveness, it simultaneously creates paranoia and suspicion. The tactician constantly monitors their surroundings for potential threats because they project their own calculating nature onto everyone else. They assume all other people are also tacticians running manipulative strategies, which makes trust impossible. They exist in a self-created prison where no relationship feels safe or genuine. This represents the trap that snares most people who reach Tier 3. You become so consumed with playing strategic games that you forget to actually live and experience life. You achieve efficiency and effectiveness, but you hollow out the parts of yourself that make existence meaningful. Numerous successful corporate executives, political figures, and entrepreneurial hustlers plateau at this exact level. They've accumulated impressive wealth and prestigious status symbols. They've won the material game by any conventional measurement. But they possess zero internal peace or satisfaction. They're locked into perpetual scanning mode, constantly analyzing their environment for emerging threats and opportunities, never able to relax or simply be. They've become the most strategically intelligent person in any room they enter, but they're still fundamentally reacting to the room itself. They remain trapped playing within a game system that someone else designed and controls. They're winning at the game, certainly, but they haven't achieved freedom from the game's fundamental constraints. To climb higher in this hierarchy, you must transcend narrow self-interest and personal survival. You must transform yourself into a force of nature that shapes reality, rather than just navigating through it. The fox survives through cunning intelligence, but the fox ultimately hides in underground burrows for safety. What happens when someone develops enough power to stop hiding entirely? That's the threshold between Tier 3 and Tier 4, and crossing it requires something most people will never develop. Tier 4 represents the operator, the lion who rules through visible strength. The operator transcends mere tactical calculation by adding a transformative element that changes everything: unshakable will and determination. Where the calculator attempts to navigate existing world structures safely and efficiently, the operator attempts to fundamentally reshape the world through concentrated force of personality combined with undeniable competence. This cognitive tier represents high-level command an executive function operating at peak capacity. The operator doesn't simply observe the chess pieces and calculate optimal moves like the tactician. They move those pieces with absolute conviction and authority, unafraid of the consequences. Conflict doesn't frighten them or cause them to seek safer paths. In fact, they thrive in conflictual environments where most others freeze or flee. Machiavelli articulated the operator's philosophy when he stated that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot achieve both simultaneously. The operator has internalized this wisdom completely. They've developed willingness to make harsh decisions that individuals at lower tiers are psychologically incapable of making due to fear of social disapproval or moral guilt. They accept the crushing burden of responsibility that comes with command positions, understanding that leadership means bearing weight that would break weaker people. At this tier, intelligence becomes generative rather than merely exploitative. You're not just identifying and taking advantage of opportunities that already exist in the environment. You're actively creating entirely new opportunities through your capacity to execute vision and make things happen in physical reality. People follow the operator not because of fox-like manipulation tactics, but because the operator represents order, structure, and direction in a chaotic universe. They function as a lighthouse cutting through fog, providing clear vision and unwavering direction. The operator possesses clear vision of what should be and demonstrates the iron discipline required to march relentlessly toward that vision, pulling everyone else along with them whether they want to come or not. However, the lion archetype contains a fatal vulnerability that eventually limits even the most powerful operators: visibility and exposure. The operator operates loudly and publicly. They position themselves at the front of every formation, in the spotlight of every achievement. They collect credit and recognition for victories, which feels rewarding, but this visibility means they also absorb blame when things fail. They become targets because their power derives from force and presence, which means it's tied directly to their physical energy and personal involvement in every situation. When the operator shows signs of illness or weakness, entire empires they've built can crumble rapidly. When they display vulnerability, predators who've been waiting for the opportunity immediately attack. The operator exists in a state of chronic exhaustion because they carry impossible weight. They believe they've achieved the kingship, reached the pinnacle of the hierarchy, but the uncomfortable truth is they've actually become the highest paid servant in the system, a slave to their own ambitions and the expectations they've created. They haven't learned the ultimate lesson about power that those at higher tiers understand completely. The most dangerous forces in the universe are the ones that remain completely invisible to ordinary perception. And that's where the truly dark waters begin, where we enter cognitive territories that institutional systems never teach, because they can't afford to have too many people operating at these levels. Are you ready to see how deep this really goes? Tier 5 introduces us to the puppeteer archetype, the invisible hand that moves without being seen. If the fox survives through cunning and the lion dominates through strength, the puppeteer controls through invisibility and psychological manipulation. The puppeteer has experienced a crucial realization that transforms their entire approach to power. Direct control, the Tier 4 operator's primary tool, is fundamentally inefficient and creates unnecessary resistance. When you apply force to push someone in a direction, basic physics dictates they push back with equal force. When you issue direct orders to another human being, you create resentment and covert rebellion. But when you architect situations where people want to do exactly what serves your purposes, you own them completely without them ever recognizing their captivity. This represents soft power in its purest form, influence operating at such subtle levels that the influenced never recognize it's happening. The puppeteer doesn't stand on public platforms delivering speeches. They position themselves in shadows behind the platform, whispering carefully crafted suggestions into the ear of the lion who thinks he's leading. They understand human psychology at its deepest layers, recognizing that all human behavior ultimately reduces to two fundamental drivers: desire for pleasure and fear of pain. The puppeteer doesn't waste energy fighting against reality or trying to force outcomes. Instead, they seduce reality itself, making it want to conform to their vision. The puppeteer specializes in narrative creation and perception management. They engineer situations with such precision that the outcome becomes inevitable while everyone involved feels they made completely free choices. They've mastered plausible deniability as both art and science. When projects collapse or initiatives fail, their name appears nowhere in the documentation or public record. When success arrives, they've positioned themselves to harvest the rewards, while others take the public credit and exposure. They operate exclusively through intermediaries and proxies, using individuals from all lower tiers as extensions of their will. The sleepers, mimics, calculators, and even the powerful operators function as the puppeteer's limbs, executing the puppeteer's will while believing they're pursuing their own interests. Machiavelli captured this perfectly when he observed that everyone sees what you appear to be, but few experience what you really are. The puppeteer lives and breathes this principle in every interaction. They've become a psychological shapeshifter with no fixed identity, transforming into whoever they need to be in any given moment to achieve their objectives. To the sleeper, they appear as an ordinary peer or friendly neighbor. To the operator, they seem like a valuable friend or trusted ally. To the calculator, they present as a loyal advisor or beneficial business partner. None of these people realize they're being steered like vehicles by an invisible driver. However, Tier 5 extracts a terrible psychological price that grows heavier with each passing year. Dissociation from your authentic self. When you spend years or decades wearing psychological masks in every interaction, never showing your true face to anyone, you eventually forget what your actual face looks like underneath all the layers. When you process every human interaction as a psychological operation designed to achieve strategic objectives, you systematically destroy your capacity for authentic human connection and vulnerability. The puppeteer accumulates enormous power, certainly, but they become a ghost haunting the world rather than truly living in it. They move through human society, but cannot be part of it in any meaningful sense. They're colder than even the calculating fox because they've killed more of their humanity to achieve their position. They observe humanity with the emotional detachment of a scientist studying bacterial cultures in laboratory conditions. They can predict human behavior with remarkable accuracy, control outcomes with precision, but they cannot be human themselves anymore. They've sacrificed that capacity for power. This represents the lonely peak of manipulative intelligence, the highest level that most students of dark psychology ever reach. Many believe this is the summit, that becoming the invisible hand represents ultimate power. But they're wrong because the puppeteer still plays the game. They're still manipulating individual pieces on a board they don't control. They're still reacting to the board's structure itself. The genuine master doesn't play the game at all. The genuine master builds the entire casino, controls the rules, and profits regardless of who wins or loses any individual hand. This is Tier 6, the architect, the system builder who thinks in entirely different categories. The architect has transcended individual manipulation completely. They don't waste time controlling individual people because they've recognized that human behavior is primarily a function of environmental design. When you want people to move in specific patterns, you don't ask them to comply or trick them into it. You simply build a hallway that only goes in one direction. The architect constructs the hallway, then watches people flow through it naturally. They create systems, ideologies, corporate structures, algorithmic frameworks, religious movements, and entire nations. They establish the fundamental rules governing the game that sleepers, mimics, foxes, lions, and puppeteers are all fighting over without realizing the game itself was designed. While the fox schemes to steal a single grape, and the lion fights to control the whole bunch, and the puppeteer convinces someone to hand over the grapes willingly, the architect owns the entire vineyard, the distribution network, and probably the retail stores where grapes get sold. This is systemic intelligence operating at civilizational scale. It represents the ability to think in second-order, third-order, and fourth-order consequences that ripple across decades. The architect thinks in generational timeframes and century-long arcs, not quarterly profit reports or annual election cycles. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up to these realities. Most people will never see this perspective. Tier 6 architects maintain detachment from individual battle outcomes because they've rigged the fundamental structure of the war itself. Consider the individuals who designed and built the social media platforms that now govern global discourse and attention. They represent perfect examples of architect-level thinking. They don't care what topics you argue about in the comments. They don't care which political faction wins today's battle. They built the arena where all battles take place, and they profit from the noise itself, from the conflict and engagement, regardless of who wins. The architect transcends simple categories of evil or good. They represent inevitability. They observe chaotic reality and perceive underlying patterns invisible to others. They see the source code behind the matrix of social reality, and they rewrite that code to their specifications. Reaching Tier 6 requires abandoning the desire for personal glory and recognition. You must abandon the desire to control individual people. Instead, you must fall completely in love with structure itself, with systems and their emergent properties. You must become a devoted student of civilizational dynamics, mastering economics, psychology, history, and physics, then weaving them into a single coherent understanding of how reality operates. Architects are extraordinarily rare. Perhaps 1 in 10 million people reaches this cognitive tier. These are the names that survive in historical memory centuries after their deaths. Not the kings who fought the wars, but the people who designed the systems that made the wars necessary and inevitable. Yet even the architect hasn't reached the final level because the architect remains attached to their creation. They still care whether the system they built functions properly. They still possess ego, even though it's projected into their work rather than their person. When their system collapses or fails, they experience suffering. There exists 1 tier higher, a level that barely seems human anymore. The 7th and final tier of intelligence isn't about adding more knowledge, more strategy, or more power. It's about subtraction. It's about becoming the void. At Tier 7, you stop being the player in the game. You stop being the game's designer. You become the silence that exists before and after all games. This is the state of total internal sovereignty and psychological independence from all external circumstances. The void has mastered the ultimate Machiavellian characteristic: complete emotional and psychological detachment from the external world and its fluctuations. They own nothing in the material sense, yet possess everything that matters. They experience no fear because they maintain no attachments that can be threatened. You cannot threaten someone who holds no preference about whether they continue living or die tomorrow. You cannot bribe someone who desires nothing you could possibly offer. You cannot manipulate someone who has no ego requiring stroking or protection. The void observes the architect's elaborate systems, the puppeteer's schemes, the lion's wars, and the fox's tricks, and they smile with genuine amusement. They perceive all of it as theatrical performance, a cosmic joke playing out on a stage. This isn't nihilism or despair about meaninglessness. Nihilism represents a collapse into darkness and depression. This is transcendence, rising above the entire game. The void operates with perfect clarity because their vision isn't clouded by desire, fear, or ego. They do exactly what's necessary in each moment, nothing more and nothing less. They resemble water in their formlessness and adaptability. Try to grasp them and they slip through your fingers. Try to cut them and they reform instantly. Try to burn them and they transform into steam only to rain down on you later from above. Machiavelli hinted at this level when discussing fortuna, the element of luck and fate representing chaos in the universe. He said approximately half of our lives are governed by fortuna and the other half by our will and choices. The void has aligned their personal will with fortuna itself. They don't fight against the current of reality. They become the current. Eastern philosophy calls this the Tao, the way of effortless action. Stoicism describes this as the sage who has achieved complete equanimity. In dark psychology, this represents the ultimate predator because they're completely unpredictable and unreadable. If you encounter someone operating at Tier 7, You're completely helpless, regardless of your own intelligence level. You cannot read their intentions. You cannot predict their next move. They reflect whatever you project onto them like a perfect mirror. Look into them, and you only see yourself. They can descend to Tier 4 when they need to lead an army, then ascend back to the void when that purpose is fulfilled. They can play the fox during negotiations, then return to emptiness. They use all the other levels as tools in their toolkit, but they don't live permanently at those levels. They live in the fortress of their own mind, a fortress with no doors that can be breached. Now the mirror stands before you, showing your reflection clearly. Where do you actually rank in this hierarchy? Be brutally honest with yourself, because self-deception is the most expensive lie you will ever purchase. Are you a sleeper, drifting through existence, reacting to stimuli, waiting for someone to give you permission to truly live? Are you a mimic, seeking applause and recognition, memorizing impressive quotes, pretending to understand concepts you've only encountered superficially? Are you a calculator, trapped in transactional thinking, paranoid about threats, lonely despite your effectiveness? Are you an operator, exhausted from carrying enormous weight, making yourself a target for everyone, seeking to take your position? Are you a puppeteer, hiding in shadows, slowly losing your soul to the masks you wear until you don't know who you are anymore? Are you an architect, building systems and obsessing over legacy? Or are you approaching the void? Statistical reality suggests most people watching this exist somewhere between Tier 2 and Tier 3. You're intelligent enough to recognize that life operates according to game-like rules, but you're still seeking validation from others, which keeps you at Tier 2. Or you're trapped in the transactional prison of Tier 3, calculating every move. That's acceptable. Awareness represents the crucial first step toward ascending higher. But you must understand that the entire system is deliberately designed to keep you down. Educational institutions are designed to mass-produce sleepers. Universities are designed to manufacture mimics. Corporate structures are designed to trap calculators. The system doesn't want architects operating freely, and it's genuinely terrified of the void. If you genuinely want to climb, you have to move against the grain of your entire biological and social programming. You have to kill the part of yourself that needs to be liked by others. You have to kill the part that needs to feel safe and comfortable. You have to accept that intelligence isn't about being nice to people. It's not about being morally right. It's about being effective at achieving your vision regardless of obstacles. So how do you actually move up this hierarchy? You don't climb by consuming more information or collecting more credentials. You climb by systematically removing illusions that cloud your perception. Moving from sleeper to mimic requires waking up to the value of knowledge and recognition that the world has structure. Moving from mimic to calculator requires stopping your obsession with what people think and starting to care exclusively about what actually works in reality. Moving from calculator to operator requires developing genuine courage and accepting responsibility for outcomes. Moving from operator to puppeteer requires learning subtlety, patience, and deep psychological understanding. Moving from puppeteer to architect requires mastering systems thinking and developing patience to work on decade-long timescales. Moving from architect to the void requires letting go of everything, all attachments, all desires, all fears, all identity. It's a long journey. It's a dark journey that most people will abandon when it gets difficult. They'll retreat to the comfort of the herd because it's warm in the middle of the flock surrounded by other bodies. It's cold standing alone on the mountain. But the view from that height, the perspective you gain, changes everything. When you stand at the summit looking down at the masses scurrying below, you realize that all the stress, all the drama, all the political conflicts, all the noise, it was all just a game. A game you no longer have to play. You can simply watch. And in that watching, you discover the only thing that actually matters: power over yourself. Before we go further, click that subscribe button if you haven't already. You're not like the others, and you know it. There exists a specific psychological technique, a hidden key that unlocks the transition from Tier 3 to Tier 4. This represents the hardest barrier to break in the entire hierarchy. It involves a concept Machiavelli called virtu, not virtue in the modern moral sense, but a ruthless, flexible prowess and capability. Most people hit their ceiling at Tier 3. They become intelligent, successful foxes who navigate the world effectively, but they remain forever afraid of the wolves. They never transform into the lion. They never build empires. Why does this barrier stop so many people? Because you still believe in the rules at Tier 3. You think that if you're smart enough, if you play the game well enough, the rules will protect you from harm. They won't. The rules exist to control you, not to protect you. The secret to breaking through, the key to entering the realm of architects and sovereign beings, requires a fundamental fracture in your moral programming. You have to develop willingness to do the one thing that society tells you is absolutely unforgivable. I cannot explain it fully in this public format. The algorithmic systems that govern content distribution won't permit it. The sleeping masses would report this content immediately if I spoke too directly. It's too sharp, too dangerous for the public domain. What I can show you publicly is merely the surface layer. There are dimensions of dark psychology that I simply cannot discuss on public YouTube without facing censorship or demonetization. The algorithm actively suppresses the most powerful information because that information threatens existing power structures. The deepest insights exist behind access restrictions. If you're still here, still watching, you're demonstrating that you're not like the others. Subscribe if you haven't already taken that step. But if you genuinely want access to what's hidden, click the join button and step into the architect level. You'll unlock exclusive, uncensored content that dives into the deepest parts of human psychology, the parts that polite society refuses to acknowledge. Most people won't. That's the entire point. The hierarchy maintains itself through self-selection. The weak filter themselves out. The strong push through.